Daniel Carter had spent years chasing urban legends, but none intrigued him as much as the mystery of Room 306. A journalist obsessed with uncovering the truth behind unexplained disappearances. He had followed countless dead ends until now. The Blackwood Hotel had been abandoned for decades, yet was far from forgotten. Rumors whispered of a cursed room, one that would vanish without a trace, taking anyone inside with it. The stories varied. Some claimed lost souls haunted the halls. Others believed the hotel itself was a living entity, consuming the unfortunate. But one fact remained consistent. No one who entered room 306 was ever seen again. Daniel sat across from Henry Lawson, the hotel's last surviving concierge, now a frail old man with trembling hands. His eyes, sunken and glassy, stared into nothingness. "If you know what's good for you, son, you'll let this one go," Henry rasped. "That room isn't meant to be found." Daniel leaned forward. "Then why does it keep appearing?" The old man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because some door should stay closed." Ignoring the warning, Daniel set his plan in motion. That night, he would sneak into the hotel and find room 306 himself. As the sun dipped below the skyline, he approached the crumbling facade of Blackwood Hotel, its broken windows like hollow, watchful eyes. The entrance loomed ahead, waiting. With a deep breath, Daniel stepped inside, unaware that the moment he crossed the threshold, he had already sealed his fate. The moment Daniel stepped inside, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, almost as if the walls themselves were breathing. Dust hung in the air like a lingering presence, disturbed only by his slow, cautious footsteps across the creaking wooden floor. The Blackwood Hotel had been abandoned for decades, yet it still carried the echoes of its past. Chandeliers hung lifeless from the ceiling, their crystals coated in filth. The grand lobby, once filled with guests and laughter, now stood in utter silence. A rotting reception desk remained in place, as if still waiting to check in another doomed visitor. Daniel adjusted the strap of his backpack, feeling the reassuring weight of his notebook, flashlight, and camera. He knew what he was looking for. Room 306, the room that supposedly did not exist. He pulled out a faded blueprint of the hotel, one he had spent weeks tracking down. Scanning the layout under his flashlight's beam, he quickly noticed something odd. There was no room 306. The numbers jumped from 305 to 307, as if the room had been erased from history itself. A sudden creak echoed through the hall. Daniel spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing, just an endless stretch of darkness. His flashlight flickered. A chill crept up his spine. Then he saw it. At the end of the hallway, where there had been nothing just seconds ago, a door now stood. Room 306. His breath caught in his throat. The number was engraved on a tarnished brass plate, aged and worn, yet somehow untouched by dust. A cold gust of air seeped from beneath the door, carrying the faintest hint of something rotten. A deep sense of wrongness settled over him, but curiosity overpowered his fear. Daniel reached out and touched the doorknob. The temperature plummeted instantly. The door unlocked with a soft click, as if inviting him in. Without hesitation, he pushed it open and stepped inside. And behind him, the hallway disappeared. The door shut behind Daniel with a quiet but final click. He turned, expecting to see the hallway he had just stepped from. But there was nothing. No door, no exit, just a smooth, unbroken wall where the entrance had been. His pulse quickened. The room itself was small, empty, and impossibly cold. A faint layer of dust covered the wooden floor, yet there were no footprints, his own or anyone else's. The wallpaper was old, peeling at the edges, its once elegant floral pattern now faded and discolored. The only furniture was a single wooden chair positioned awkwardly in the center of the room. Something about it felt wrong. Daniel lifted his camera, snapping a picture. The flash flickered weakly, as if the very air resisted being captured. He checked the screen. The photo was completely black. His flashlight flickered. A sharp static noise crackled from his pocket. Daniel pulled out his phone, but the screen was a glitching mess of distorted shapes and unreadable text. He had a fully charged battery when he entered, yet now it was at 1%. A sudden thud. The chair had moved. It was subtle, just a few inches from where it had been before, But Daniel knew for certain he hadn't touched it. He swallowed hard. The temperature dropped even further, his breath now visible in the dim light. His instincts screamed for him to leave, but there was no exit. Then, from the farthest corner of the room, he heard it, a whisper. At first, it was faint, like wind slipping through a crack. But then it grew, a chorus of overlapping voices, speaking in tones both pleading and accusing. Daniel gripped his flashlight, swinging it toward the corner. Nothing, but the whispering continued. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his blood run cold. His shadow had changed. Instead of his own silhouette, the shape cast against the wall was wrong, distorted, taller, with too many limbs. His heart pounded as he slowly stepped back. The chair suddenly scraped across the floor, moving toward him with deliberate intent. And then, the whispering stopped. Silence swallowed the room, thick and suffocating. Daniel turned toward the wall, where the door had been. The number 306 was still there, carved into the wood. But now, beneath it, new words had appeared, etched deep as if scratched by desperate hands. No one leaves. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps as he backed away from the scratch message on the wall. The room was shifting, the air growing thicker, heavier, pressing against him like an invisible force. The whispering returned, but now it was clearer. Pleading voices, some soft, others frantic, overlapping like a chorus of the damned. Help us. It won't let us go. You shouldn't have come. Daniel swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his notebook. He needed to document this. He needed proof. His fingers closed around the worn cover, but before he could open it, a cold gust of air swept through the room, sending loose dust swirling in unnatural patterns. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second, he saw them. Figures. Pale, hollow-eyed silhouettes stood in the corners of the room, their bodies flickering like a bad signal. Their faces were twisted, frozen in expressions of terror and despair. Some reached toward him, their fingers stretching like shadows cast by an unseen flame. Daniel's knees nearly buckled. He forced himself to step forward, heart hammering. Near the chair, something caught his eye, a journal, half buried beneath the dust. It was old, the leather cracked and brittle, its pages yellowed with time. He hesitated, then knelt and picked it up. The name on the cover was almost unreadable, but he could make out the year, 1923. With a trembling hand, he flipped through the pages. The handwritten notes inside were frantic, scrawled in desperation. The words told a story eerily similar to his own. I found room 306. It shouldn't be here, but it is. I can hear them. The lost ones. They speak in whispers, but they are trapped, and soon I will be too. Daniel's throat went dry. He turned the page. The writing became more erratic. The room is alive. It watches. It waits. It feeds. His stomach twisted as he read the final entry. I understand now. The room doesn't let you go. You don't leave. You become part of it. The moment he finished reading, the air turned ice cold. The whispers stopped. And then, something moved in the reflection of his flashlight. Daniel's gaze shot toward the far wall. A large mirror hung there, one he hadn't noticed before. His reflection was staring back at him, except his eyes were missing. Daniel stumbled backward, heart pounding, but as he did, his reflection did not move. It remained frozen, still watching him with empty sockets. Then, ever so slowly, it smiled. The whispering resumed, but now it came from the mirror itself. The surface began to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen force. Daniel felt something tug at him, an invisible pull dragging him toward the glass. He struggled, but his body wasn't his anymore. His legs locked in place. His hands twitched involuntarily. The figures in the room moved closer, and in the mirror, his reflection began to fade. Daniel fought against the invisible force pulling him toward the mirror, his muscles straining, as if he were sinking into an unseen current. The whispers grew louder, now a chaotic chorus of voices, speaking over one another. Some begged him to resist. Others urged him to surrender. In the rippling glass, his reflection continued to fade, becoming a hazy silhouette, a mere shadow of what he had been. But something else was emerging in its place. A figure, identical to him in every way, except for its hollow, eyeless stare. It mimicked his movements, but slightly off, as if it were learning how to be him. Then it smiled, a slow, unnatural grin that sent cold terror through his veins. "Not yet," the reflection whispered. Daniel gasped. The voice didn't come from the glass. It came from inside his own head. The force intensified, yanking him closer. His boots scraped against the dusty floor as he dug his heels in. He gripped the edge of the chair, trying to anchor himself, but his hands were growing numb, as if they were already part of somewhere else. His camera hung around his neck, swinging wildly with his movements. In desperation, he grabbed it and snapped a photo of a mirror. The flash went off, but something changed. The moment the light hit the glass, the reflection jerked backward, as if recoiling in pain. The whispers distorted, turning into a screeching static. Daniel's grip broke free. He stumbled back, gasping, feeling his body return to him. The mirror's surface began to crack, deep fissures spreading across it like veins. The whispers turned to screams. The figures in the room lurched forward, their arms reaching for him. Daniel didn't hesitate. He swung his flashlight, shattering the mirror into pieces. A deafening silence followed. The figures froze. The room itself seemed to exhale, as if a great weight had been lifted. Then, the door was back. Room 306's entrance stood where it had once disappeared, the tarnished brass gleaming faintly in the dim light. Daniel's heart pounded as he rushed toward it. He gripped the handle, expecting resistance, but this time the door swung open easily. He stumbled out into the hallway, except it wasn't the same hallway anymore. The walls were clean, the air fresh. The decay and dust were gone. Instead, a soft glow bathed the corridor, as if the hotel had been restored to its former glory. But something was wrong. The Blackwood Hotel had been abandoned for decades. So why did he hear voices and laughter coming from the lobby? Daniel turned, his breath catching in his throat. The plaque on the door still read 306, but beneath it, new words had appeared. "Welcome, Mr. Carter. We've been expecting you." Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears as he stared at the new inscription beneath the door number. "We've been expecting you." His fingers twitched, itching to grab his camera, but somehow he already knew the lens wouldn't capture this. The hallway stretched before him, eerily pristine, bathed in the soft golden glow of flickering chandeliers. The walls, once cracked and faded, were now covered in rich, dark wood paneling. A plush red carpet lined the floor, muffling his footsteps as he took a hesitant step forward. He recognized the architecture, the layout, but something was off. It was as if the Blackwood Hotel had been rewound in time, restored to its former elegance. But this place had been abandoned for decades. So why did he hear the faint sounds of jazz music drifting from below? Daniel's breath was shallow as he moved cautiously down the hallway. He passed doors that should have been rotting and broken, yet now stood perfectly polished, each with golden room numbers gleaming under the dim light. A whisper of fabric, movement just out of sight. He turned sharply, but the corridor was empty. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. Then a voice. "Sir, are you lost?" Daniel froze. A man stood at the end of the hallway, dressed in a deep red bellhop uniform, his cap neatly in place. His expression was calm, almost welcoming, but his eyes were wrong. They were too dark, too hollow. Daniel's throat tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to stay still, his fingers tightening around his camera. "Where am I?" he managed, his voice hoarse. The bellhop's smile didn't waver. "You're right where you should be, Mr. Carter. The Blackwood is delighted to have you." Daniel's stomach churned. He never told him his name. He took a step back, but the bellhop mirrored him, smooth, unhurried movements, like a predator closing on its prey. "The others are waiting for you in the lobby," the man continued, gesturing down the hallway toward the grand staircase. Daniel followed his gaze and felt his blood run cold. Figures stood at the top of the staircase, dressed in elegant 1920s attire. men in sharp suits, women in flowing evening gowns. They were engaged in lively conversation, glasses in hand, laughter filling the air. Except they weren't real. Their faces flickered, their outlines shimmering like a projection that wasn't quite aligned. Some of them were stuck in loops, repeating the same gestures. Lifting a drink, nodding, laughing, lifting a drink again. And then, all at once, they turned to face him. Every single one of them. Their expressions froze, their smiles lingering just a second too long. The bellhop took another step forward. "Come now, Mr. Carter," he said, voice smooth as silk. "You don't want to be rude to our guests." Daniel's breath hitched. The figures at the staircase began to move, stepping down toward him in eerie, synchronized motions. He spun around, ready to bolt, but the hallway behind him was gone. Only blackness remained. And then, from deep within the shadows, came a whisper. "You belong to the Blackwood now." Daniel's heart raced as the walls of the hallway closed in, the space around him growing tighter and tighter. The faint whispering from the shadows only made his stomach tighten further. He stumbled backward, his gaze flicking between the bellhop, who stood perfectly still, and the figures descending the staircase, their hollow eyes fixed on him. It was as though the very air in the hallway had thickened, and the golden glow from the chandeliers turned darker, more sickly. Daniel had no idea where to run, no way to escape. He turned desperate, his eyes scanning the walls for any sign of an exit. And that's when he saw it. At the far end of the hall, almost invisible in the growing shadows, stood an arched doorway, framed in tarnished brass. The frame shimmered faintly, almost out of place, as if it didn't belong here. The bellhop's voice pierced the air, sharp and clear. "The room is ready for you, Mr. Carter." Daniel didn't think twice. He bolted for the door, not caring whether the bellhop or the figures noticed him. With every step, the hallway seemed to stretch on further, becoming an impossible distance, as if the building itself wasn't letting him leave. But he kept running. He reached the door and slammed into it. It creaked open, revealing a darkened room beyond. He didn't hesitate. He stepped through. The room was cold, colder than anything he'd felt before. The air was thick with scents of decay, as though this place had been untouched for decades. But there was something more. It felt alive. Alive in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Daniel's feet hit the floor with a muffled thud. He squinted into the darkness, the faint scent of rot filling his nostrils. The room was larger than it should have been, its walls stretching into an impossible void. In the center, a single chair sat, positioned directly beneath a single, flickering light bulb. The room seemed to pulse around him, as if the walls themselves were breathing. He stepped further inside, and the door slammed shut behind him with finality that rattled his bones. The moment the door closed, everything went silent. Then, from the corner of the room, a soft voice whispered, "Sit." The command was not spoken by the bellhop, but by something else, something older, more ancient. Daniel froze. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't want to obey. He didn't want to move at all. But the voice, it was compelling. It made his body feel like it no longer belonged to him. Slowly, as if against his will, Daniel walked toward the chair, his hands trembling at his sides. His feet felt like lead, each step taking him deeper into a space where time no longer mattered. He reached the chair, his fingers brushing against the dust-covered armrest. A cold shiver ran through him as he sat down, his body sinking into the chair's worn cushions. The light above him flickered again, casting erratic shadows on the walls. And then the whisper returned. "Welcome, Mr. Carter." This time, the voice was different, stronger, more familiar. He looked around frantically, his heartbeat loud in his ears. Suddenly, the walls began to shift, their surfaces cracking open, revealing dark shadows slithering out like creeping tendrils. The shadows twisted, growing into shapeless forms that pressed in on him. Daniel's breath quickened. He tried to stand, but his body refused to move. The shadows seemed to anchor him to the chair. From the void, figures emerged, their faces blurred, but their eyes empty, like those of the bellhop, like the guests in the lobby. And then one stepped forward. This one was different. His eyes were not hollow. Instead, they were filled with a terrifying recognition, as if he knew exactly what Daniel had done, what he was about to become. "You can never leave," the figure said, its voice echoing in Daniel's mind. Suddenly, everything made sense. The hotel, the whispers, the shadows. It was a trap, a place where souls were kept, where time stopped, and the living became part of the forgotten. And Daniel, unknowingly, had just become its newest guest. The figure before Daniel stepped closer, its dark eyes never leaving his face. The air around him grew cold, suffocating, the shadows tightening like invisible chains. His body felt paralyzed, trapped in the chair, unable to escape the grip of this otherworldly force. "You are here to stay," the figure whispered, its voice low and sinister, yet oddly familiar. Daniel's heart hammered against his chest, the weight of its words sinking deep into his soul. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, but his limbs wouldn't obey. The more he tried to move, the heavier the air around him became. "What is this place?" Daniel managed a croak, his voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head slightly, its face becoming clearer, though still distorted by the flickering light. There was something ancient in the creature's eyes, something that made Daniel's skin crawl. "This is the Blackwood," the figure said, "a place where forgotten linger." Daniel felt a cold sweat form along his brow. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He was no longer in the physical world. This was a place of limbo, a paradox of time and space where the lost souls wander forever, trapped in cycles of despair. He swallowed hard, tried to suppress the panic rising in his throat. "You mean, I'm dead?" The figure's lips curled into an eerie smile, but it was not comforting. No, it was a twisted grin, the kind that made your stomach turn. "No, Mr. Carter," it replied, its voice colder now, almost mocking. "You're not dead yet, but soon you will be." A chill shot through Daniel's spine. Not dead yet. That was worse than anything he could imagine. He was caught somewhere between the living and the dead, somewhere where time had no meaning and souls never found peace. The figure reached out, its hands stretching unnaturally long, its fingers like blackened branches. They brushed lightly against Daniel's cheek, and he gasped. It wasn't human. Before Daniel could react, the figure stepped back, its form distorting, as if it was shifting between dimensions. "You're not meant to be here," the figure continued, voice echoing in the room. "But now that you are, there's no escaping." A low rumble vibrated through the walls. The entire room felt as if it was shaking, as though the very fabric of reality was coming undone. From the corner of his eye, Daniel caught movement. A shadow, something large and fast, moved in and out of his peripheral vision. He turned quickly, but it was gone. Then the shadows started to whisper again. They spoke in an unintelligible language, a soft chant that became louder with every passing second. Daniel's heart pounded louder in his chest, as if it were syncing with the pulse of the hotel itself. "What do they want?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking. The figure chuckled softly, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. "They are the ones who remain," it said cryptically. "They are the souls of the lost, the ones who can never leave the Blackwood." Before Daniel could process the information, the shadows around him began to shift violently, like a sudden storm. The walls twisted and groaned, and the ceiling above him cracked, releasing more of the inky blackness that seemed to consume the room. The whispering grew louder, demanding, pleading. The voices tangled and layered on top of each other. Daniel felt the air grow thicker, his vision narrowing. The room around him began to distort, the walls folding in like a sickening illusion. Time itself seemed to bend. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. "You are one of us now," the figure's voice boomed. In an instant, Daniel's body jerked upright. The shadows rushed in, closing around him like a swarm, and the world spun out of control. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the bellhop, standing in the corner, his eyes glowing with otherworldly light. Then there was nothing. The world was dark, too dark, as if the very light had been drained from existence. For a moment, Daniel wondered if he had truly died, if everything had finally ended. But then he felt it, the sensation of cold, of wetness against his skin. He gasped for air, his lungs aching, as if they hadn't breathed in ages. His eyes shot open, but the darkness around him was so thick, it was as if his vision had been stolen. Then, a soft sound muffled whispers. "Daniel!" The voice was distant, echoing in the void. He tried to focus, but his mind was clouded, and his body felt as though it was numb, as if he were suspended in time. "Daniel!" The voice repeated, more insistent this time. It was familiar, but also alien, like a distant memory reaching out to him from beyond. Slowly, his senses returned. The darkness began to flicker away, replaced by dim, pulsating lights in the distance. He could feel the cold floor beneath him, hard and uneven, and the faint vibrations that echoed through the space. Daniel's heart pounded as he tried to push himself to his feet. But the moment he moved, a sharp pain shot through his body. His muscles ached as though they hadn't moved in years. He forced himself up, leaning against the wall for support. As his vision cleared, he realized he was no longer in the same room. He was in a different place, one filled with ancient stone walls, crumbling pillars, and the faint sound of dripping water. The air was thick with the scent of decay. Daniel shivered, panic crawling up his spine. Where was he? How had he gotten here? "Daniel, you're awake." This time, the voice was clearer. He turned, and his eyes locked onto a figure standing just a few feet away, its face cloaked in shadows. He couldn't make out any details, but something about the voice, the calmness in it, made him instinctively trust the figure. "Where am I?" Daniel croaked, his voice hoarse, dry. The figure stepped forward, the air around it shifting, as though it were not quite part of this world. "You are in the depths," the figure answered. "A place where the lost wait, a place where time fractures." The figure reached out, and Daniel felt an almost magnetic pull toward it. "Come," the voice urged gently. "They are waiting for you." Daniel hesitated, the darkness creeping at the edge of his vision. He knew, he could feel it, that something was terribly wrong. Yet the figure's voice was so calm, so reassuring. He stepped forward, driven by a strange compulsion. The moment his foot hit the cold stone floor, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, more desperate. The temperature seemed to drop further, the air thickening, pressing it on him from all sides. The figure led him through a winding corridor, damp and oppressive, until they reached a large chamber. It was vast, almost endless, its ceiling lost in shadows. At the center of the room stood a large stone pedestal, illuminated by the eerie glow of floating orbs that hovered in the air. The orbs seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, casting a sickly green light on the stone surface. And then Daniel saw them, figures, hundreds of them, standing in a circle around the pedestal. Some were hunched, others standing tall, but all of them had empty eyes that followed his every movement. They were souls, trapped in this place, just like him. Who are they?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking. "They are the lost, the ones who could never leave," the figure replied. "They have been here for as long as the Blackwood has existed." Daniel took a step back, his mind racing. The room was suffocating, the weight of the souls pressing in on him. He tried to leave, but the path he had taken had disappeared, swallowed by the shadows. "You can't leave," the figure said, its voice turning cold. "No one leaves the depths." Daniel's body went cold. He felt his heart skip a beat as he realized the terrifying truth. The Blackwood had claimed him, just as it had claimed all those before him. And now there was no escaping. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the souls were urging him to join them, to become a part of the never-ending cycle of despair. In the center of the room, the pedestal began to glow brighter, and Daniel could see that it was covered in strange symbols, pulsing with dark energy. Without warning, the ground beneath him shifted, and he stumbled, nearly falling into the pedestal's glow. A cold, heavy hand gripped his shoulder, stopping him just in time. "It's too late." The figure's voice was now a low growl. "The Blackwood owns you now." Daniel turned to face it, but before he could react, a deep crack echoed through the chamber. The ceiling above began to break apart, and the stone walls seemed to collapse in on themselves. A wave of darkness engulfed the room, and Daniel was pulled into the void. Daniel's body felt as though it were being pulled in every direction at once. The darkness consumed him, an overwhelming weight pressing against his chest, suffocating him and forcing the air from his lungs. He couldn't breathe. His heart raced as his limbs flailed, caught in the grip of an unseen force. His body felt weightless, as if he were falling into an endless pit of blackness that stretched on forever. The world around him was a blur. He could no longer feel the cold stone beneath his feet, nor the shadows that had surrounded him in the chamber. Everything had dissolved into a void of pure nothingness. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the whispers began again, faint, distant, like the murmur of 100 voices lost in the wind. They spoke his name. Daniel. The voices were soft, almost soothing, but there was a sense of urgency in them now. Familiar voices, voices that reminded him of something he couldn't quite remember, something from his past. His pulse quickened as he tried to reach out, desperate to cling to something, anything in the void. Daniel, don't fight it. The voice grew louder, more insistent. He wasn't sure if it was his mind playing tricks on him, or if it was a figure from earlier, but he had to respond. He had to understand. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the dark. There was a brief pause, the whisper still for a moment, and then the voice responded, clearer now, as though the figure were standing right next to him. "I am the keeper of the lost. I am what remains when everything else fades away." The voice was soothing yet filled with an otherworldly power that sent chills down Daniel's spine. He could almost feel the presence of something vast and ancient hovering near him, just beyond his reach. "Where am I?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. He had to understand the reality of his situation. There had to be a way out. "You're in the Blackwood," the voice responded softly. "A place of endless darkness. A place where those who are lost remain." Daniel's mind reeled. The Blackwood. He had heard the name before, but he couldn't remember when. The memories were fading, slipping away like sand through his fingers. The voice seemed to read his thoughts, responding almost immediately. "The Blackwood is not a place of the living, Daniel. It is a realm for the lost, those who cannot escape what haunts them." Daniel clenched his fists, his frustration growing. Lost? Was he dead? Was this the end? "No," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not one of them. I'm not dead." The voice seemed to sigh, a heavy sound, like the echo of 1,000 years. "It's not about life or death. It's about what you leave behind." A sudden realization struck Daniel, like a sharp knife to his heart. He was caught in the Blackwood, a place that wasn't bound by the laws of life or death. It was a limbo, a place for souls who couldn't find peace, who were trapped in their own regrets and fears. "I can't help you, Daniel," the voice continued, its tone softer now. "But you can help yourself. You have to face what you've left behind. Only then will the Blackwood release you." Daniel's breath hitched in his throat. His mind spun as fragments of memories rushed back to him. Broken moments, fractured pieces of his life, each one more painful than the last. He saw flashes of his mother's face, twisted in grief. He saw his best friend, standing in the rain, staring at him with eyes full of betrayal. His chest tightened as he realized that the Blackwood was more than just a place of lost souls. It was a place of reckoning, where regrets and unresolved guilt manifested in the form of shadows, trapping him in this nightmare. He was being forced to confront the darkest parts of himself, the things he had buried deep within his mind, the things he had never wanted to face. I can't do this." The voice was silent for a long moment before it spoke again, softer now, almost as if it were trying to offer him some comfort. "You are stronger than you think, Daniel. You must face your past. Only then can you truly escape." The shadows around Daniel began to twist and writhe, as if responding to his inner turmoil. He could feel the darkness pressing in, suffocating him, trying to drag him back into the void. But something inside of him shifted. He could feel it, a faint spark of determination. He wasn't ready to be lost forever. Not yet. He had to find a way out. And that meant facing everything he had run from. Daniel stood in the void, his chest tight with fear and regret. The darkness that surrounded him seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, oppressive and suffocating. His mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions, all swirling around the same painful thought. Could he really face what he had buried for so long? The voice in the darkness had told him that he could escape, but only if he confronted his past, the things he had hidden away in the deepest corners of his soul. He couldn't run anymore. Taking a deep breath, Daniel forced himself to take a step forward. His body felt heavier than ever, as though the weight of his past was physically holding him back. But he gritted his teeth and pushed onward, knowing that there was no other way out of the Blackwood. The whispering voices were growing louder, insistent, a constant murmur in the background, like the hum of 1,000 souls trapped in endless despair. They seemed to be calling to him, urging him to remember, to face the truth. But Daniel didn't know if he was ready. He had spent so much time running from his past, from the people he had hurt, the mistakes he had made. Could he really look at them head-on? Could he bear the weight of it all? The ground beneath his feet began to change. The smooth stone he'd been walking on cracked, and jagged edges poked through the floor, sharp and unforgiving. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of decay began to overpower everything else. And then he saw it, just ahead, in the distance, a flickering light. It was weak, almost imperceptible, but was there. It called to him, a beacon in the unrelenting darkness. He knew what it was. The memories, without thinking. He quickened his pace, drawn to the light, as if it were the only thing that mattered. The further he walked, the louder the whispers became, until they were screaming in his ears. Their voices overlapped, a cacophony of anguish and regret. And for a moment, Daniel felt like he was going to collapse under the weight of their sorrow. But he didn't stop. The light grew brighter as he approached, and when he reached it, he was not prepared for what he saw. The light flickered once more, and suddenly he was no longer in the Blackwood. He stood in the middle of a familiar street, his old neighborhood. The houses around him were exactly as they had been, except everything was faded and washed out, as though the world itself were slowly decaying. His heart pounded in his chest. This was his past. This was where it all began. He turned to see a familiar figure in the distance, his mother, standing in front of their old home. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, like she had been waiting for him for a long time. "Mom," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. She didn't respond. She just stood there, her gaze fixed on him, as if she were waiting for him to take the next step. Daniel hesitated. He had never been able to look his mother in the eye after the things he had done. After all the lies, the promises broken, he had been a bad son, and he knew it. But now in this strange, decaying version of his childhood home, the guilt weighed on him more than ever. He could feel the shame crawling under his skin, burning him from the inside out. He had to face her. He had to make things right. "I'm sorry, Mom." The words escaped his lips before he even knew what he was saying. For a moment, everything was still. There was no movement, no sound, just the distant, mournful whispers of the Blackwood echoing around them. And then, slowly, his mother's lips parted. "You can't change the past, Daniel." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through him like a knife. She stepped forward, and the world around them seemed to shift, the fading houses becoming more distorted. "You can't undo what you've done." The words were a weight on his chest. He could feel the burden of every mistake he had made, every regret he had tried to run from. But as he stood there, facing her, something shifted within him. The shame, the guilt, it was all still there, but now it was different. It wasn't something he could run from anymore. It was something he had to accept. "I know." Daniel's voice broke. "But I can try. I can make it right." His mother didn't speak again. She just nodded, as if she had been waiting for him to understand. The light around them began to grow brighter, and the fading world around them started to dissolve. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished. Daniel was back in the Blackwood, but this time it felt different. The weight of the past was still there, but it wasn't suffocating him anymore. He had faced it, and that was the first step toward his freedom. The voices in the darkness were still there, but they were no longer screaming. Now, they whispered in approval. "You have faced your past, Daniel." The voice from before spoke, its tone softer now. "You are no longer lost." Daniel looked around. The black void no longer as oppressive. The shadows still lurked, but they didn't feel as threatening. He had accepted what he had done, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a small glimmer of hope. He had started the journey to freedom. But it wasn't over yet. The Blackwood had lost some of its grip on Daniel, but he knew he wasn't free yet. The whispers around him had softened, but their presence was still haunting, lingering in the air like a constant reminder of the darkness he had faced. He wasn't done. There was still something deep inside that he needed to confront. The shadowy realm seemed to pulse around him, alive, as if the very air was aware of his every step. But now, Daniel's mind was focused. He had faced his mother, confronted his past, and accepted the guilt and regrets that had tormented him for so long. But there was still one final truth he hadn't yet allowed himself to see, the reason why he was truly lost in the Blackwood. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, determined to face whatever came next. He didn't know what he was walking toward, but there was a clarity in his chest now. He was no longer running. The world around him shifted, as if the Blackwood itself was reacting to his resolve. The oppressive darkness began to dissolve, revealing what seemed like an endless expanse of twisted, barren trees, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like the fingers of lost souls. The air smelled of decay, of something long dead, and the faintest hum of a distant bell echoed through the emptiness. As he walked further into the woods, the shadows seemed to creep closer, wrapping around him in an almost protective way. He could feel the tension in the air, as though something was waiting for him to reach the end of this journey. Something that would finally reveal the truth he had buried deep within himself. Then, out of nowhere, the path before him split into two, one leading deeper into the woods, and the other toward a bright, blinding light in the distance. The choice was clear, and yet the weight of it was almost too much to bear. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. Both paths seemed to offer different kinds of freedom, but they came with different truths he might not be ready to face. The light was beckoning him, promising peace, while the darkness seemed to want to pull him deeper, to force him to confront more of his pain. A distant, familiar voice echoed in his mind. "You have the choice, Daniel." It was the same voice that had spoken to him in the void, the one that had guided him through his journey. But this time, there was no hint of judgment in it, no condemnation, just a quiet, steady tone of understanding. You must face the hardest choice of all. To move forward, you must choose what you're willing to leave behind. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the words to sink in. He had accepted his past. He had made peace with the people he had hurt. But now, he had to let go of the pain, the guilt, the endless cycle of self-doubt that had kept him imprisoned. He had to decide whether to carry the weight of his past with him into the light, or leave it behind in the shadows, allowing himself to finally be free. Taking one last deep breath, Daniel made his decision. He turned his back on the bright light, knowing that peace would come later. He had to face the darkness one final time to truly be free. With each step into the dark woods, the air grew heavier and the shadows pressed closer. His feet moved almost of their own accord, as if the Blackwood was guiding him toward the very heart of his own torment. The twisted trees seemed to bend toward him, their branches clawing at the sky like hands reaching for salvation. Then, just as his chest tightened with dread, a flash of lightning illuminated the sky, revealing a figure in the distance, a man dressed in tattered clothes, standing motionless in the middle of the path. The air was still. The figure didn't move. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. There was something familiar about this man. He couldn't place it at first, but as he approached, he realized the truth. This was the last person he needed to confront, the one who had been missing all along. Himself. The figure before him was a mirror of Daniel. The same face, the same eyes, but with a haunting sadness that Daniel could feel deep in his soul. The man's eyes seemed to look right through him, as though he had seen all of Daniel's sins and regrets. And now he was the one who would decide his fate. "It's time, Daniel." The figure's voice was hollow, broken, but undeniably his own. Daniel swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He had been running from this moment for so long, but now, standing before himself, he knew there was no turning back. "You have to forgive yourself," the figure continued, his voice echoing in the stillness of the woods. "Only then will the Blackwood release you." Daniel took a shaky step forward, his heart pounding. He didn't know how to forgive himself. The guilt, the shame, it had consumed him for so long. But as he looked into the figure's eyes, he knew that this was his moment. The truth was simple. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to let go. "I forgive you," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. And as soon as he said the words, the figure in front of him vanished, leaving nothing but the empty woods in its wake. The darkness began to lift. The oppressive weight that had clung to Daniel's chest for so long finally dispersed, and the air around him felt clearer. He had made peace with himself. And with that, the blackwood began to fade away. The blackwood, once a terrifying, oppressive force, now seemed like a distant memory, fading into the darkness like a nightmare slipping away with the dawn. Daniel stood in the place where it had all started, the woods now a calm, peaceful landscape. The eerie shadows had vanished, and in their place, a soft glow lit the path ahead. The feeling of dread and fear that had gripped him for so long was gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was free. He looked around, his eyes searching for any signs of the otherworldly presence that had tormented him. The towering trees, once twisted and gnarled, were now tall and majestic, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air was crisp, fresh, and alive with the scent of pine and earth. It felt like he had stepped into a new world, one that wasn't consumed by darkness. Daniel exhaled deeply, his chest light as though the heavy weight of the blackwood had been completely lifted. For the first time, he wasn't just existing, he was living. He had faced the worst of himself, his fears, and his past, and he had survived. There was no more running from the truth. He had come to terms with the person he had been, and in doing so, he had found the courage to change. As he walked through the woods, the path seemed to open up in front of him, guiding him toward the horizon. The air was filled with the sound of birds calling, their songs bright and welcoming. It was as if nature itself had joined in his freedom. The world felt alive again, filled with possibility. Daniel's eyes caught something in the distance. A house. It wasn't much, just a humble cottage nestled at the edge of the woods, but it was enough. There was something about it that called to him, a place of peace and restoration. He knew it was time to stop running and settle into the world he had fought so hard to escape. With each step toward the cottage, the sense of hope grew stronger. He wasn't alone anymore. There was a new kind of clarity within him, a calm certainty that he had never experienced before. The world ahead was filled with challenges, but he was ready to face them, not with fear, but with a strength that came from accepting who he was. When Daniel reached the cottage, he paused for a moment, taking in the simplicity of it. The windows were open, letting in the light, and the door stood slightly ajar as if inviting him in. He pushed it open slowly, stepping inside. The interior was cozy, filled with natural light that filtered through the wooden beams. There was a feeling of warmth, a stark contrast to the cold void of the blackwood. It was a place that spoke of peace, of a life lived in balance, far from the chaos that had once consumed him. The air inside smelled of fresh bread and something faintly floral, as though someone had been living here, tending to the space with care. It was a welcoming, familiar atmosphere, a place where one could heal. Daniel could feel the peace that radiated from the walls, and it seemed to settle deep in his soul, washing away the last remnants of his torment. He wandered through the cottage, taking it all in. Every room seemed to hold something of beauty, something of life. The walls were lined with shelves of books, their leather spines worn but sturdy. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth spreading throughout the room. It was a place where time moved slowly, gently, without the oppressive weight of the past bearing down on him. As Daniel stood by the window, gazing out at the woods beyond, he realized that he had found the peace he had longed for. The blackwood was no longer a prison. It had been the path he needed to take to find the freedom he had been searching for all along. His past no longer controlled him. He had broken free from its chains. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace, not just with the world, but with himself. He had overcome the darkness. He had won. Daniel had found the peace he so desperately sought, or so it seemed. The calm of the cottage, the surrounding woods, and the quiet life he had imagined all seemed perfect. He spent his days tending to the garden, sitting by the hearth, and reading the old books he had found in the cottage. Each day was a small step toward rebuilding a life that was finally his to live. Yet, even in the quiet solace, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. The blackwood had vanished. The shadows had retreated. But deep within him, there remained an echo, a whisper of something he couldn't quite grasp. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of memory that would pass through his thoughts when he least expected it. A face, a moment, a feeling that seemed to arise from somewhere deep within the dark recesses of his mind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a shade of deep violet, Daniel sat at the window of his cottage, staring out at the now calm woods. The soft glow of the setting sun illuminated the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. It was a serene scene, but the nagging feeling in his chest grew stronger. Suddenly, a distant sound broke the silence, the faintest sound of footsteps on the path leading to the cottage. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His first instinct was to brush it off, to tell himself that it was nothing. But as the footsteps grew louder, a familiar, unsettling feeling crept over him. It wasn't the blackwood, it wasn't the shadows, but something about those footsteps filled him with a deep sense of foreboding. The door creaked open slowly. Daniel turned, his heart pounding in his chest. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure he had not seen in years, his mother. But this was no reunion of joy or love. The woman before him looked just as she had when he last saw her, standing in that old, abandoned house all those years ago. Her face twisted with the same sorrow and regret. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The mere presence of her sent waves of unease through Daniel's mind, as if the past he had worked so hard to forget was now staring him in the face. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air was thick with tension, the quiet broken only by the sound of Daniel's racing heart. This was the one part of his past that had never fully let go, the connection he shared with his mother, the things left unsaid, the questions that had gone unanswered. And now, here she was, standing at his doorstep as though nothing had changed. "Why are you here?" Daniel finally managed to ask, his voice strained. His hands clenched at his sides, and his throat tightened as memories flooded back. Memories he thought he had buried for good. His mother stepped forward slowly, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You think you can escape, Daniel?" Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but the words cut through him like a knife. The Blackwood was never just a place. It was inside you, and you can't run from yourself. Daniel stepped back, his mind spinning. Her words rang in his ears, an echo of all the doubts he had been battling since the beginning. Was she right? Had he truly faced everything that haunted him? Or was there more he needed to confront? The peace he had felt in the cottage suddenly felt fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I've faced everything. I've come to terms with my past." His mother's expression softened, almost sadly. "But you haven't. You've locked it away, thinking that hiding from it would make it disappear. But it's still here, Daniel. It always will be." She reached out toward him, her hand trembling slightly as it hovered in the air between them. Daniel could feel the weight of her presence, heavy, suffocating, just like before. She wasn't just an apparition. She was the embodiment of all the things he had failed to address, the pain he had tried to bury. For a moment, Daniel considered running. He could leave the cottage, go back into the woods, and try to escape the conversation he was dreading. But something inside him, something deep and primal, knew that this was the final step, the last truth he needed to confront. The darkness had never fully left him. It had only been waiting for the right moment to resurface. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Daniel said, his voice stronger now. He met his mother's eyes, no longer flinching. "I've already faced my fears. I've already forgiven myself." The air in the room seemed to shift as his mother's form began to fade, her features blurring like a mirage in the wind. For a moment, Daniel thought she would say something more, something that might pull him back into the past. But instead, she simply disappeared, leaving behind an empty silence. And with that, the feeling of unease lifted. The shadow of his mother and all the unresolved emotions she represented began to dissolve. For the first time, Daniel felt like he had truly faced his past. Every painful, difficult piece of it. The cottage, the woods, everything around him seemed to breathe again. The truth had been confronted, and now there was nothing left to hold him back. He walked back to the window, gazing out at the twilight. The world was still, quiet. The night was calm. Daniel knew now that he had made it. The peace he had sought for so long was his. and he could finally move forward without fear. The next morning, Daniel awoke to a new sense of clarity. The night before had shaken him, but it had also given him the final pieces of his journey. The haunting presence of his mother, the unresolved pain of his past. It had all come to a head. Now, as the first light of dawn broke through the window, Daniel felt a shift within himself, a finality that he hadn't felt before. The cottage was peaceful, quiet, but the lingering feeling of having faced his greatest fear still echoed in his mind. For years, Daniel had been running, hiding from the truth, from the parts of himself he didn't want to face. But last night had changed everything. He had confronted his past. He had faced the darkness and the fears that had kept him bound to the Blackwood. And now, for the first time in a long time, he felt free. But even in the midst of his freedom, something gnawed at him, something left unresolved. It wasn't the fear of the Blackwood or his mother's ghost. It wasn't even the shadows that still lingered in the back of his mind. No, it was a feeling that there was something left unfinished, a thread that needed to be tied before he could truly be free. Daniel left the cottage and walked into the woods. The forest was no longer the foreboding place it once was. The trees were tall and majestic, the path winding through them calm and inviting. But even with the serene beauty of the world around him, he felt an urge to return to where it all began, the heart of the Blackwood. He needed closure. He needed to make sure that the darkness that had consumed him for so long was truly gone. As he walked deeper into the forest, the air grew heavier. The peaceful sounds of nature began to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. The trees here were older, the shadows deeper, and the feeling of being watched returned. It was as if the forest itself remembered him, knew him. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, but Daniel pressed on. He reached the clearing where the Blackwood had once been a living nightmare, the place where everything had started. The ground was still marked by the remnants of the darkness that had taken root here. The earth was scarred, the trees twisted, and the shadows lingered like specters, unwilling to leave. This was the heart of the Blackwood, the source of the evil that had plagued him. Daniel stood in the center of the clearing, taking in the dark, oppressive atmosphere. His heart pounded in his chest as he remembered the horrors he had faced, the whispers in the night, the figures that lurked in the shadows, the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare he could never escape. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It was time to end it, once and for all. "I'm not afraid anymore." The words left his lips, quiet but firm. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was here to face what had haunted him for so long. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, and the shadows seemed to shift. The ground beneath him trembled as if the Blackwood itself was alive, reacting to his defiance. The air grew colder, and Daniel could feel the presence of something dark and powerful, looming in the shadows. But this time, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. From the darkness emerged a figure. At first, it was only a silhouette, but as it came closer, Daniel recognized the shape. It was the same figure that had haunted his dreams, the entity that had watched him, followed him, controlled him. But this time it was different. There was no malice in its eyes, no anger or hate. It was simply a presence, a manifestation of everything he had feared, everything he had failed to understand. "You've come back, Daniel." The voice was soft, almost mournful, but it still sent a chill down his spine. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming clearer. It was like a shadow, a dark outline of a person with no real features, just a presence that seemed to exist in the space between the physical and the ethereal. Daniel stood tall, no longer shrinking from the entity. "I'm not running from you anymore." The figure nodded slowly, as if understanding. "You think you defeated me, but you have only confronted your own fear." The words hit Daniel like a blow. He had always thought the Blackwood was an external force, something beyond his control. But now he realized that the darkness, the shadows, the fear, it had all been a part of him. He had been running from his own soul, afraid of confronting the parts of himself he had buried deep. "You're not real." Daniel's voice was steady. "You're just a part of me, and I am done hiding." With those words, the figure dissolved, fading into the air like smoke. The darkness that had gripped the clearing began to fade as well. The trees straightened, the shadows receded, and the ground seemed to heal before his eyes. Daniel stood there, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of the past lifting off his shoulders. The blackwood, the darkness, the fear, they were gone, and in their place was peace. Real, lasting peace. The clearing was quiet once more, the forest calm and still. Daniel knew that his journey was finally over. He had faced the deepest parts of himself, and now he was free. The forest was still, the silence almost sacred. The shadows that had once stretched across the clearing, heavy and oppressive, now seemed to retreat, leaving the space bathed in a soft, warm light. The air felt fresher, almost as if the land itself had been cleansed of a deep-rooted pain. Daniel stood in the center of it all, his heart still racing, but this time it was with a sense of completion. The blackwood, the twisted place that had once been the source of his darkest nightmares, was now nothing more than a memory. He could feel it in his bones, the last remnants of fear and darkness dissolving into the earth beneath him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of freedom. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from his chest, and the breath he took felt lighter than ever before. Daniel had fought so long to escape the shadows, to outrun the echoes of his past, but now he understood. The darkness had never been an external force. It had always been a reflection of the fear, guilt, and regret buried deep within him. By confronting it, by facing it head-on, he had found the only true way to heal. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the woods, Daniel turned away from the clearing and started his walk back to the cottage. The path was familiar now, the same one he had walked countless times before, but this time it felt different. There was no longer any fear in his steps. He was not running towards something or away from something. He was simply walking, content with where he was. The cottage stood quietly in the distance, a place that had once seemed so distant and lonely, but now felt like a sanctuary, a home, the life he had started to build for himself, the life he had worked so hard to piece together, felt more real than ever. Inside, the warmth of fire flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, but it wasn't a dark, ominous feeling. It was a comforting, soothing presence. The walls that had once felt like the confines of his prison now seemed to embrace him, as if the house itself recognized the transformation he had gone through. The new beginning he had longed for was no longer a distant dream. It was here, in this moment, and it was real. Daniel sank into his chair by the hearth, looking out the window at the peaceful woods. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves outside in a soft, melodic rhythm. The world outside was still, silent, calm, and full of possibility. There was a feeling of gratitude that washed over him as he reflected on everything he had endured. The fear, the pain, the darkness. He had faced them all. And now, he had emerged on the other side, stronger, wiser, and more at peace than he had ever been before. As he sat there, watching the fire crackle, Daniel knew that this was not the end, but the beginning of something new. His past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. The journey of self-discovery, of healing, was one that would continue, but now it was a path he could walk with his head held high, without the weight of fear dragging him down. The phone on the table beside him buzzed, breaking the quiet. Daniel glanced at the screen and saw a message from an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. He smiled softly as he read the words. "How are you? It's been a long time. Let's catch up soon." It was a simple message, but it marked something important. A connection to the life he had once thought lost, a life that was now within reach. He wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't defined by his fears. He wasn't trapped in the past. As he stood up and walked toward the door, Daniel took one last look around the cottage, taking in the stillness, the peace, and the hope that now filled every corner. The forest, the blackwood, everything that had once been a source of terror, was now a part of his past. It was a chapter he had closed, and now the future lay ahead, full of endless possibilities. And as Daniel stepped outside into the crisp evening air, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't just a word. It was a real, tangible feeling that wrapped around him. And for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next.